Good evening, and welcome back to SleepCurrent. This is another Unsolved History Explained Before Sleep episode, and tonight we're going to travel to a small group of islands in the North Atlantic, far off the western coast of Scotland, a place where the sea is rarely calm, the wind rarely quiet, and for much of the year, the surrounding water feels almost permanently restless. These are the Flannan Isles, a scattered chain of rocky islands rising sharply from the Atlantic. Most of them are little more than steep cliffs and rough grass, surrounded by waves that have been shaping the rock for thousands of years. Only one of the islands was ever permanently occupied. Its name is Eilean Mòr, and at the very end of the 19th century, something important was built there: a lighthouse. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse began operation in 1899. At the time, shipping traffic around the northern and western coasts of Scotland was heavy. Fishing vessels, cargo ships, and passenger steamers all passed through these waters. And in winter especially, storms moving across the Atlantic could turn the surrounding sea into something extremely dangerous. The lighthouse served a simple purpose: to warn passing ships that these cliffs were there at all. Because on a dark night, in rough weather, a vessel might not see the cliffs until it was far too late. Running a lighthouse like this required constant attention. The lamp had to be maintained, fuel had to be monitored, the lens needed cleaning, and the light itself had to operate reliably every night. For that reason, 3 lighthouse keepers were stationed on the island at all times. They worked in rotation, living together for weeks in a place where the nearest neighbors were many kilometers away, and where the sound of the sea was almost always present. Once every few weeks, a relief ship would arrive. It would bring supplies, new personnel, and take one of the keepers back to the mainland for rest. Under normal circumstances, this was a routine process. But in December of 1900, that routine was interrupted. On the morning of December 26th, the lighthouse supply vessel Hesperus approached the islands. Its job was simple: deliver the relief keeper and collect the man whose rotation had ended. As the ship came closer to Eilean Mòr, something immediately seemed unusual. The lighthouse should have been visible with signs of activity. Normally, one of the keepers would be waiting near the landing area, ready to help guide the supply boat through the difficult approach along the cliffs. But that morning, no one appeared. The sea conditions made landing difficult, so the ship waited offshore for some time. Still no signal from the island. Eventually, the relief keeper on board, a man named Joseph Mòr, was put ashore alone. He climbed the steep path from the landing area toward the lighthouse buildings, and as he approached the station, a strange quiet began to settle in. The door to the lighthouse compound was closed, but the island felt unusually still. Inside the buildings, Mòr would soon discover something deeply unsettling. The lighthouse had clearly been in operation. The equipment was in order. But the 3 men assigned to the station had vanished. And from the very beginning, there were signs that whatever had happened quickly. Before we try to understand what might have happened on the island, it helps to understand the men who were stationed there. Because lighthouse keeping, especially in places like the Flannan Isles Lighthouse, was not simply a job. It was a life defined by routine. 3 keepers would normally serve together on the island. They worked in rotating shifts so that someone was always responsible for the light. Every evening, the lamp had to be prepared. At the time, the lighthouse used a powerful paraffin vapor lamp designed to burn brightly through the large Fresnel lens that focused the beam out across the Atlantic. The system worked well, but only if it was carefully maintained. Fuel pressure had to be monitored. Glass surfaces had to remain clean. And throughout the night, a keeper would periodically check the lamp room at the top of the tower. Out on the Atlantic, ships depended on that light being reliable. Inside the lighthouse compound on Eilean Mòr, the keepers followed a structured daily rhythm: cleaning equipment, maintaining the lantern, inspecting landing gear and supply cranes used to haul cargo up the cliffs, and of course, keeping detailed records. Lighthouse keepers maintained a daily logbook where they noted weather conditions, maintenance tasks, and anything unusual that might affect navigation. In December of 1900, 3 men were assigned to this station. The principal keeper was James Ducat. Ducat was experienced and widely regarded as reliable. Working under him was the second assistant keeper, Thomas Marshall. Marshall had previously served at other remote stations and was familiar with the difficult weather that Atlantic lighthouses often faced. The third man on the island that winter was Donald MacArthur. MacArthur was not normally assigned to the Flannan Isles. He had been sent as a temporary replacement while another keeper was on leave. By most accounts, these were capable and experienced men. They were used to isolation. They were used to storms. And they were used to the long, quiet weeks that lighthouse service required. But isolation changes the rhythm of daily life. Weeks could pass without seeing another person beyond the 2 men sharing the station with you. News from the mainland arrived only when the supply ship returned, and during winter, Atlantic weather could make that wait even longer than expected. In fact, the relief ship that was supposed to visit the island shortly before Christmas had already been delayed by storms, which meant the 3 keepers remained alone on the island longer than planned. Still, nothing in the early records suggested any serious problems. The lighthouse was functioning normally. The equipment was being maintained. And inside the logbook, the keepers continued recording their observations as usual. But then, something changed. The final entry in the station log was written on December 15th, 1900. After that date, no further notes appear. The light itself continued shining for several nights afterward. Ships passing through the area reported seeing it, but when the relief vessel finally reached the island on December 26th, there were no keepers left to greet them. And whatever had happened on Eilean Mòr had already happened days earlier. When Joseph Mòr reached the lighthouse compound on Eilean Mòr, the first impression was not chaos, it was order. The buildings were quiet, but nothing appeared immediately disturbed. Inside the kitchen area, Mòr noticed something small but unusual. One of the chairs had been slightly pulled back from the table, not dramatically overturned, just out of place enough to suggest someone had stood up quickly. But otherwise, the room looked normal. There were no signs of a struggle, no damage to the interior, no indication that anything violent had taken place inside the station. Moving further through the lighthouse quarters, Mòr checked the sleeping areas. The beds were unoccupied. Clothing remained where it should have been. Everything suggested that the men had simply stepped outside. But then, another detail stood out. In the entrance area where the keepers normally hung their weather gear, only 2 oilskins were missing. The third was still hanging on its peg. For lighthouse keepers working near the cliffs, oilskins were essential. Heavy, waterproof coats designed to protect against freezing Atlantic wind and spray. Which raises an obvious question. Why would one of the men leave the lighthouse without putting his on? Outside the buildings, the investigation continued. Mòr and the crew from the relief ship soon began examining the western landing area of the island. This was where supplies were normally brought ashore, but the geography of the island made landings complicated. The island actually had 2 landing areas, an eastern landing normally used in calmer conditions, and a western landing used when rough weather made the other approach difficult. Most of the damage investigators documented appeared around the western landing, and here, they found the first signs that the weather had recently been severe. A storage box used to hold mooring ropes had been damaged. Iron railings along the cliff path showed signs of impact, and some equipment used for securing cargo had been displaced. At first glance, these details seemed to support the idea of heavy seas reaching the base of the cliffs. And that possibility was taken seriously by investigators from the Northern Lighthouse Board, the organization responsible for the station. But the weather itself raised another puzzle, because when the relief vessel Hesperus arrived on December 26th, conditions in the area were relatively calm. In fact, several ships passing through nearby waters during those days reported mixed conditions, some describing rough seas, while others recorded relatively ordinary winter weather. Which means whatever damage had occurred along the landing area likely happened earlier, perhaps days earlier. And somewhere between the final logbook entry on December 15th and the arrival of the relief ship 11 days later, all 3 keepers had disappeared. No bodies were found along the cliffs. No clothing or equipment was recovered from the sea. And despite careful searches of the island itself, there was no trace of the men anywhere on Eilean Mòr. The lighthouse was intact. The buildings were orderly. The equipment had clearly been maintained. But the 3 men assigned to keep the light burning through the winter were gone. And to understand how that might have happened, investigators would soon begin considering several possible explanations. Once the initial search of Eilean Mòr was completed, the responsibility for understanding what had happened fell to the Northern Lighthouse Board. The organization oversaw lighthouses throughout Scotland, and incidents at remote stations were taken seriously. A formal investigation was conducted. Witness statements were collected. The condition of the landing areas and equipment was documented, and gradually, a number of possible explanations began to emerge. The first, and most widely accepted, explanation involves the weather. The western landing area of the island showed clear signs of damage. A storage box used for ropes had been broken open. Iron railings near the cliff path had been bent, and some equipment normally secured to the rocks had been displaced. These details suggested that powerful waves had recently struck the base of the cliffs, something not unusual along exposed Atlantic coastlines. During winter storms, large swells can travel enormous distances across open water, building energy long before they ever reach land. Investigators therefore considered the possibility that the keepers had gone down to the landing area to secure equipment during rough seas. If a particularly large wave had struck the rocks below, it could have swept 1 or more men into the water. And once someone had fallen into the sea there, survival would have been extremely unlikely. But this explanation still leaves an important question. Why were all 3 men outside? Lighthouse procedure normally required that one keeper remain inside the station at all times. The light had to be monitored, and abandoning the post entirely would have been considered unsafe. One possible answer is that the situation outside had suddenly become urgent. If equipment near the landing area appeared to be at risk of being torn away by the sea, multiple keepers might have gone down together to secure it. In that scenario, one man could have been caught by a wave. The others may have rushed forward in an attempt to help, placing themselves in the same danger. Within moments, all 3 could have been pulled into the water. Another explanation sometimes suggested is that the men went outside during a sudden storm and were simply overwhelmed by the weather. But here, the historical record becomes more complicated. Although the island showed signs of heavy seas, weather reports from ships passing through the region during those days were mixed. Some captains recorded rough conditions. Others described the sea as relatively normal for winter, which means the most dangerous waves may not have been caused by a storm directly over the island. Instead, one possibility often discussed is what sailors sometimes call a rogue wave. These are unusually large waves that form when several swells combine. They can appear unexpectedly, even when the surrounding sea does not seem especially dangerous. Along exposed Atlantic cliffs, like those of the Flannan Isles, such waves can rise dramatically as they strike the rock face. For anyone standing near the edge, the force would be overwhelming. Of course, over the years, other explanations have appeared. Some writers suggested conflict between the keepers. Others speculated about accidents inside the lighthouse. And in more imaginative retellings of the story, supernatural theories occasionally appear as well. But when historians examine the surviving evidence, most of those ideas quickly fall away. There were no signs of violence inside the station, no evidence of a struggle, and nothing suggesting that the men had deliberately abandoned their post, which leaves the simplest explanation. 3 experienced lighthouse keepers likely went down to the cliffs during dangerous sea conditions. Something went wrong, and within a very short period of time, all 3 men were lost to the Atlantic. But because no one witnessed the moment itself, the exact sequence of events on that December day in 1900 remains unknown. In the years that followed, the disappearance at Flannan Isles Lighthouse slowly became part of maritime folklore. Stories circulated. Some versions added dramatic details that do not appear in the original investigation. Others imagined supernatural explanations, as if the isolation of the islands itself required something mysterious to fill the silence. But when historians return to the documented evidence, the story becomes quieter, and in some ways, more human. 3 men were living on a remote Atlantic island, performing work that depended heavily on routine. Maintaining the lamp, recording weather, inspecting the landing gear used to haul supplies up the cliffs. Most days would have been uneventful, the kind of steady, repetitive work that lighthouse keeping often required. But environments like the Flannan Isles have a way of reminding people that routine can change very quickly. A loose piece of equipment, a sudden swell rising against the cliffs, a moment where someone decides to step outside to check something that seems minor. And within minutes, a situation that felt manageable can become dangerous, especially along exposed coastlines where the Atlantic has very little to slow it down. For the investigators who examined the island after the disappearance, the most likely explanation remained a tragic accident involving the sea. Yet even that conclusion leaves certain details unresolved. Why all 3 men went outside? Why one of the oilskins remained inside the lighthouse? And exactly what sequence of events unfolded along the cliffs below the station? Those small gaps are probably why the story continues to be remembered. Not because it requires something supernatural, but because it leaves just enough uncertainty for the imagination to linger. Today, the lighthouse on Eilean Mòr still stands. Its light still sweeps across the surrounding waters, much as it did more than a century ago. Ships passing through the area rarely think about the 3 keepers who once maintained the light there. But somewhere along those cliffs, in the winter of 1900, something happened that no one ever fully witnessed. And the final moments of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur were carried away by the sea. If you've come across another interpretation of the Flannan Isles disappearance, I'd be interested to hear it. And if there's a historical mystery you'd like explored in a future episode, feel free to suggest it. We'll explore another chapter of history soon.